I still remember the exact smell of my father's library. Not the generic scent of old books that people describe in novels, that romantic combination of vanilla and decay. This was sharper, more specific. The smell of first editions that had never been read, of pages that had been turned only by white gloves, of ambition preserved in climate-controlled glass. It smelled like money pretending to be art, like competition dressed as inheritance, like the particular loneliness of a man who collected stories because he could not tell his own. I was 41 when I finally understood that the library was not a gift. It was a trap, and my father had spent 40 years baiting it. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you are new here, my name is Meredith, and what I am about to tell you is a story about the codicil that ate my family. Not metaphorically, not poetically. A literal legal document that forced three adults who had spent decades avoiding each other to live in the same house, solve the same puzzle, and confront the same question that my father had planted like a bomb in the foundation of everything we believed about ourselves. If you have ever discovered that your family was a mystery novel, and you were not the detective but the victim, stay with me. Hit that subscribe button, turn on your notifications, and listen until the end, because this story does not end with an inheritance. It ends with a plaque, a donation, and the first honest conversation three strangers ever had. Here is my story. My father, Reginald Ashworth, was a man who edited mystery novels for a living and lived inside one. He was not famous. The authors he edited were famous. Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, and Gayo Marsh, the women who defined the golden age of detective fiction and whose first editions lined the walls of our house like a museum of other people's genius. My father was the invisible hand. The man who suggested the red herring, who tightened the alibi, who made sure the butler did not actually do it because that would be too obvious. He was good at his job. He was terrible at being a father. I was the daughter who stayed. That was my role in the family drama. The one I chose or the one that chose me, I have never been able to tell the difference. Julian was the eldest, the son, the heir apparent who had fled to Singapore the moment he turned 18 and had returned only for weddings and funerals, and even then only briefly, only performatively, only long enough to remind us that he had escaped and we had not. Daphne was the middle child, the actress, the one who had inherited our mother's bone structure and our father's talent for performance, who appeared in regional theater productions of plays no one had heard of, and who treated every family gathering as an audition for a role she was determined to win. Our mother died when I was 12. Cancer, the official story, though I would later learn that in my family, official stories were just first drafts that had not yet been revised. After her death, the house became quieter. My father retreated into his library, emerging only for meals that he ate in silence, and for the occasional lecture on the importance of preserving literary heritage. Julian left for boarding school and never really came back. Daphne went to drama school and came back only when she needed money or an audience. And I stayed, because someone had to, because the house needed a caretaker, because I had convinced myself that staying was a choice rather than a failure to escape. I was 40 when my father began to change. Not dramatically, not visibly, but I noticed the tremor in his hand when he reached for his tea. I noticed the way he began to forget names, not just of neighbors but of authors he had edited for decades. I noticed the bottles of pills that appeared in his bathroom, the doctor's visits that he refused to discuss, the way he began to look at me with an expression I could not read, something between guilt and calculation, the look of a man who was planning something and was not sure if he should warn the people it would affect. He died 6 months later. I was the one who found him in the library, slumped over his desk, a first edition of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd open in front of him, a pen in his hand, a note on the page that I could not read because my hands were shaking too badly to hold it steady. The official cause was heart failure. The unofficial cause, I would learn, something else entirely. The funeral was small. Julian flew in from Singapore, stayed for exactly 24 hours, and left before the will was read. Daphne arrived the morning of the service, wearing black that she had clearly bought for the occasion, and spent the reception networking with my father's colleagues, collecting business cards, mentioning her upcoming production of The Mousetrap with a desperation that made me want to apologize to everyone she cornered. I stood by the urn, accepting condolences from people who had known my father professionally, but had never seen him laugh, never seen him cry, never seen him do anything except discuss plot structure and royalty rates. The reading of the will happened a week later. The three of us gathered in the office of my father's solicitor, a man named Mr. Pemberton, who had the exhausted patience of someone who had mediated family disputes for 40 years and had learned to expect the worst. The will was straightforward. The house would be sold, the proceeds divided equally. The investments would be liquidated, the proceeds divided equally. The personal effects would be distributed according to a list that my father had updated annually, a list that gave Julian the watch our grandfather had worn, Daphne the jewelry our mother had left, and me the china that no one had used since before I was born. And then Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat. He produced a second document, smaller, handwritten, dated 2 weeks before my father's death. A codicil, he said, to the original will, an amendment that concerned the library. I looked at Julian. He was checking his phone, barely listening, already calculating his share of the investments in whatever currency Singapore used. I looked at Daphne. She was examining her nails, which were painted a color called morning mauve, and I knew she was rehearsing the scene in her head, the moment when she would tell her theater friends about the dramatic reading of her father's will. Mr. Pemberton read the codicil aloud. My father's handwriting, shaky but legible, the penmanship of a man who had spent his life editing other people's words and who had finally written something of his own. The library, he had written, the complete collection of first editions, manuscripts, and associated materials, shall not be divided. It shall be inherited, in its entirety, by the child who solves the mystery it contains. The clues are in the books. The time allowed is 6 months from the date of my death. If no child solves the mystery within that time, the library shall be donated to the Society of Bibliophiles, and my children shall receive nothing. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian looked up from his phone. Daphne stopped examining her nails. And I felt something cold settle in my stomach, the familiar sensation of being manipulated by a man who had spent his life making other people's plots work. What mystery? Julian asked. His voice was careful, the voice he used in boardrooms when he was about to acquire something. Mr. Pemberton shrugged. I am afraid I do not know. Your father was most insistent that the mystery was real, that the clues were genuine, and that the solution would be obvious to the child who deserved the inheritance. Deserved, Daphne repeated. She said the word the way she said her lines on stage, with emphasis that suggested she was about to deliver a monologue. What a theatrical way to divide property. Very on brand for Daddy. It is legally binding, Mr. Pemberton said. The house must be maintained as a residence for the three of you for the duration of the 6 months. You must live here together or forfeit your claim. Your father was quite specific. Julian stood up. This is absurd. I have a job, I have a life. I cannot spend 6 months playing a game. Then you forfeit your claim, Mr. Pemberton said. He said it without emotion, the way my father would have edited a particularly melodramatic line. The choice is yours. Julian sat down. Daphne laughed, a sound like breaking glass. And I looked at the window, at the garden where my father had spent his final years walking in circles, and I understood that this was not a game. This was my father's final novel. And we were the characters. We moved into the house the next day. Julian took the master bedroom, the one our parents had shared, with the same entitlement he had shown since childhood. Daphne took the guest room, the one with the best light for her makeup routine. I took my childhood room, the small space at the end of the hall where I had read my father's books and dreamed of being the detective instead of the victim. The library was the center of the house, a room that occupied the entire ground floor, with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a ladder on wheels, and the climate control system that my father had installed at enormous expense. 10,000 volumes, collected over 50 years, each one catalogued, each one insured, each one a piece of literary history that was worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. We began to search. Not together. Never together. Each of us alone, in the hours between the meals that we ate in silence, looking for clues that we could not define in books that we had never been allowed to touch as children. Julian approached it as a business problem, creating spreadsheets and flowcharts, analyzing the collection for patterns of acquisition, looking for financial anomalies that might reveal the mystery. Daphne approached it as a script, reading the dedications aloud, searching for hidden meanings in the inscriptions, performing the role of the brilliant detective who would solve the puzzle through intuition and flair. I approached it as a daughter. I looked for my father's hand, his edits, his marginalia, the notes he had written in books that were supposed to be pristine, and I found them. Not clues exactly, but changes. Alterations. Dedications that had been modified, dates that did not match, inscriptions that referenced events that had never happened. In a first edition of Murder on the Orient Express, I found a dedication to my mother that was dated 2 years after her death. In a manuscript of Gaudy Night, I found a note in my father's handwriting that referenced a meeting with Dorothy L. Sayers in 1963, 3 years after she had died. In a collection of letters, I found references to a son that my father did not have, to a child born in 1975 who would have been Julian but with a different name. I showed them to Julian, not because I wanted to share, but because I needed to know if he had seen similar anomalies. He had. In the financial records, he had found payments to a woman in Brighton, monthly transfers that had continued for 20 years, that had stopped abruptly 5 years ago. The woman was named Clara Halloway. She had died in 2019. She had been, according to the obituary Julian found, a retired nurse who had never married and who had spent her final years in a nursing home, visited regularly by a man who signed the visitor book as R.A. R.A. Reginald Ashworth, our father, visiting a woman we had never heard of, paying her for decades, hiding her existence in the margins of his financial life. "Who is Clara Halloway?" Julian asked. We were in the kitchen, the first time we had spoken directly in weeks, the first time since childhood that we had shared information rather than guarded it. "I do not know," I said, "but I think she is part of the mystery." Daphne found something too, not in the books but in the manuscripts. In a box of her own papers, stored in the attic, she found a play she had written at 19, a one-act drama about a family secret. My father had rejected it, told her it was melodramatic, told her she did not understand the genre. But in the margin of the manuscript, in his handwriting, she found a note. Not a critique, a confession. "You are closer than you know," he had written. "The truth is always in the middle child." We met in the library that night, not by plan. We had all come separately, drawn by the same need to be in the room where our father had spent his life, the room that contained whatever truth he had hidden. Julian brought his spreadsheet. Daphne brought her manuscript. I brought the books with their altered dedications. And for the first time, we pooled what we knew. "Clara Halloway," Julian said. "Nurse. Brighton, paid for 20 years, died 2019. "The middle child," Daphne said. "The truth is always in the middle child." "What does that mean?" "It means," I said slowly, "that we are not looking for one secret. We are looking for several, and they are connected." We worked through the night. Not as siblings, not as competitors, but as 3 people who had been given a puzzle and who were finally desperate enough to solve it. Julian found more payments, not just to Clara, but to other women, in other cities, stretching back to the 1970s. Daphne found more manuscripts, not just hers but Julian's, childhood stories that our father had annotated with comments that now read like clues. I found more alterations in the books, dedications that referenced children who did not exist, meetings that had not happened, a life that my father had constructed parallel to the one we knew. And then, at 4 a.m., Julian found the letter. It was in a first edition of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, the book my father had been reading when he died. Not in the pages, but in the binding, slipped between the cover and the spine, hidden so carefully that only someone looking for something would have found it. It was addressed to Julian in my father's handwriting, but it was not a letter from a father to a son. It was a letter from an editor to a character. "Julian," it began, "if you are reading this, you have found Clara. You have found the payments. You have begun to understand that the life you believed was yours was constructed, edited, revised until it served the plot. I am not your father. Clara was not your mother. You were born in 1975 to a woman who could not keep you, and I took you because I needed a son, because my wife needed a child, because the narrative of our family required an heir. Your biological father was my best friend, my colleague, the man who taught me everything I know about mystery. He died before you were born. He never knew you existed. And I have spent 40 years ensuring that you never knew the truth, because the truth would have destroyed the story I was telling." Julian read it in silence. Then he read it again. Then he folded it carefully, placed it on the table, and walked out of the library. We heard the front door open, then close. We did not see him for 3 days. Daphne and I continued without him. Not because we were callous, but because the puzzle had its own momentum, because we were close to something, because the 6 months were ticking away and the library was worth more than either of us could afford to lose. We found more letters, hidden in more books, each one addressed to a different child, each one revealing a different layer of the lie. To Daphne, in a manuscript of Strong Poison, "You are not my daughter either. Your mother had an affair with her director in 1978, and you were the result. I knew from the beginning. I stayed because I loved her, because I loved the performance of our family, because I believed that love was not biological but contractual. I edited you into my life the way I edited novels, and I have spent 40 years waiting for you to notice the inconsistencies." To me, in a first edition of Gaudy Night, the book I had loved since childhood, Meredith, the only one who is mine, the only one who stayed, the only one who never asked questions because you were afraid of the answers. I am sorry for what I am about to do to you. The codicil is not about the library. It is about forcing the three of you to see each other clearly without the narrative I constructed. The mystery is not in the books, it is in the family, and the solution is not who inherits. It is who survives the truth. I read it 3 times. Then I went to find Julian. He was in the garden where our father had walked in circles. He had been drinking something expensive from our father's cellar, and his eyes were red but not from tears, from rage. From the particular rage of a man who has discovered that his entire identity was a plot device. He knew, Julian said, he knew that I was not his son. He knew that Daphne was not his daughter. He knew that you were the only one. And he made us compete anyway. He made us hate each other for 40 years over an inheritance that only one of us had any right to. That is not true, I said, but I did not know what was true anymore. I only knew that my father had constructed a mystery that was not about books or money or literary heritage. It was about 3 people who had been raised as siblings and were in fact strangers. Daphne found us in the garden. She had been crying, her morning mauve ruined, her performance shattered. She had found another letter, not from our father but from our mother, written in 1979, hidden in a jewelry box that Daphne had inherited. It explained everything. The affairs, the adoptions, the lies. It explained that none of us were biologically related to each other or to Reginald, that we were all adopted, from different families, at different times, because our mother could not have children and our father needed a family for his narrative, that the payments to Clara and the other women were not for secret children but for the biological mothers who had given us up, who our father had paid for silence, for distance, for the right to rewrite our origins. We were not siblings. We were not even related. We were 3 characters who had been cast in a family drama by a man who understood plot better than love. The 6 months ended on a Tuesday in November. We gathered in the library, as the codicil required, to announce our solution. But we had no solution, not in the way our father had intended. We had only the truth, and the truth was that there was no mystery in the books, only the mystery of why 3 adults had spent 40 years believing they were a family. Julian spoke first. He said that he did not want the library, that he had spent his life acquiring things that did not matter, that the money from the house and the investments was enough, that he was done with the narrative of inheritance. Daphne spoke next. She said that she had found her own manuscript in the attic, the play she had written at 19, and that she finally understood what our father had meant. You are closer than you know. The truth is always in the middle child. The middle child was not her. It was the space between us, the silence where the real story lived. I spoke last. I said that I had spent my life staying, waiting, believing that love was sacrifice and that sacrifice was staying in a house that did not want me. I said that I did not want the library either. Not because it was tainted, but because it was never mine. It was my father's story, and I was tired of living inside other people's stories. We decided to donate it, not to the Society of Bibliophiles, as the codicil required, but to a foundation for adopted children with a condition. The condition was a plaque, displayed in the library, that read, "This collection was inherited by 3 people who were not family, and who took too long to discover that it did not matter. We sold the house." Julian returned to Singapore, but he emails now, occasionally, about books he has read that remind him of our father's collection. Daphne's production of The Mousetrap was a success, and she dedicated it to the middle child, which the critics found cryptic and which I understood perfectly. I moved to a small apartment near the sea, where I write my own stories, not mysteries but memoirs, the truth of a life that I am finally constructing for myself. I see them sometimes. Julian when he is in London, Daphne when her play tours. We meet for coffee and we do not talk about our father or the library or the 6 months that changed everything. We talk about books we are reading or plays we have seen, or the ordinary weather of our separate lives. We are not siblings. We are not friends exactly. We are something else. Something that does not have a name in the genre that our father spent his life editing. We are three people who were raised by a man who believed that love was a plot twist, and who are learning, slowly, that love is actually the absence of plot. The quiet choice to show up, to listen, to be present without expectation of inheritance or revelation or surprise ending. I am Meredith. I am 41 years old, and this is not the end of my story. It is the first chapter I wrote myself. See you in the next story.